Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome. Today I am making a card using a few stamp sets by Honeybee Stamps. I am using the Seasonal Sweeties, Bushel in a Peck, and Zen Floral. I'm making a trifold card here, so I cut a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock to 5.5 by 12 and I scored every 4 inches so that this is just slightly smaller than an A2 size card. I also took 3 panels here of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to just slightly smaller than each one of those panels. For my first panel, I'll be using this little girl in the Seasonal Sweeties stamp set. And for the leaves, just because I will be masking, I use some of the leaves from the Bushel in a Peck set just because they're a little bit larger and easier to cut masks from. So my plan for this card is to basically start off with a storm-like and then kind of go into a better day. It's an encouragement card. So for this one, I am going to make it look like wind, hopefully. And so I'm stamping all these little leaves to make it look like they're flying around. Masked all of my images. I had a hard time with this mask. I'm trying to be careful. I have red nail polish on and I don't want to leave a streak on my cardstock. I should have probably just removed the nail polish, but I had a little bit of hard time with this mask in particular. For my next panel, I will be using the other little girl in the Seasonal Cuties stamp set, and I'll just be stamping her on the bottom, and that'll be the only stamp that is on this particular panel. For this mask, I actually cut it into pieces. The umbrella, the top of the umbrella is a separate mask, and the little girl is a separate mask, and then the little dog is a separate mask. That's just the easiest way to cut a mask when it's an image like this. For my third panel, I'll be using the same image as we used on the second, but I'm going to change it up just a little bit. So I took one of the stamps from the Zen Floral stamp set, and I want to make it look like she's holding these flowers. So I went ahead and stamped those, and I know I'm going to be doing some ink blending on this, but I planned on using fairly light colors, so I didn't have to stamp or to mask out that entire floral arrangement. Next, I took some Post-it note tape and just masked out the areas of the stamp that I don't want to be stamped out. I just basically want her. I don't want the umbrella or the dog. Then I realized that she was going to be covering up some of those flowers. So I did have to end up masking just 2 of those little individual flowers. I didn't worry about the rest of them. Then my ink had started to dry on the stamp, so I had to re-ink it. So I had to remask those areas that I didn't want stamped. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have gotten a good impression. I filled in the little lines that I was missing from her little jacket there with just a Copic Safe pen. I am using a EK Success journaling pen. And now my mask was cut based on the stamp, and when I drew in my lines, I made it a little bit smaller than what the actual stamp was, so I did have to cut that mask down a little bit. Next, for my ink blending, I'll start off with my first panel, and this will be the darkest panel. So I am using Faded Jeans and Chip Sapphire. And I basically just covered the entire thing with the Faded Jeans and then went in around the edges with the Chip Sapphire. I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend just yet. I do not have a stencil that would mimic wind or anything like that. So I took a strip of Post-it note tape and kind of just cut out little squiggly lines. and I'll just put that right over my panel. This will mask out some of the areas. Now I should have waited for the Distress ink to dry a little bit because they didn't stick as well as I would have wanted them to. But once I had those down, I went over the entire panel again with the same 2 colors of Distress ink. As those little masks were coming up, I kind of realized that it was a little bit too light underneath them anyway. Once I remove the mask, you can see it almost looks white in comparison to how dark the ink blending got. So once I did remove those, I just added just a little bit of the faded jeans over that to make them not so light. I wanted them to blend in with the background a little bit more. For my next panel, I will keep out that faded jeans and I will add in broken china. And I'm going to be stamping out, there's this little stamp in the Seasonal Cuties stamp set. It's just little raindrops. So I'm taking my Versamark ink and just stamping those all over the panel randomly. It's kind of hard to see. You have to kind of shine it in the light to see where you're stamping to make sure you don't go over where you've already stamped. I'm not using heat embossing powder here. I'm just the Versamark because I want it to be kind of subtle, but it will somewhat resist the Distress ink. So again, on the top, I will focus on the darkest color, which is the faded jeans, and towards the bottom, I will blend that out with the broken china. You can see slightly there the raindrops. That's all I wanted. I just wanted it to be pretty subtle. If you want it to be bolder and you want those raindrops to stand out a little bit, you can use clear or white embossing powder after you use that Versamark, and that will completely resist the ink. For the third panel, I am using tumbled glass and shaded lilac. I wanted it to be a very, very light background. So my tumbled glass will be on the top and my shaded lilac will be on the bottom. Here I noticed a little ink smudge from my fingers. So I just used my sand eraser very, very lightly. You can see where I use the sand eraser. Whenever you do ink blending over that area, it kind of removes the surface of the cardstock, so it will be a little noticeable. I just went over it a couple of times with the ink to make it as dark as possible with such a light color, so hopefully it won't be too noticeable. Once all of my ink blending was done, I went ahead and removed all my masks. For this first panel, I did end up splattering a little bit of water in the background. I just felt like it needed a little bit something extra. So what I'll do is, because I colored these little girls on all 3 panels pretty much the same way, I'll show you one and then I'll skip to the next image. I'm starting out with her skin here and I'm using the same 4 colors as I typically do. I start out with my lightest color, map out where my darkest areas will be, go in with my darkest color, then my 2 midtones, and then back out with my lightest. Her little arms and legs are very, very tiny. You could get away with just 2 colors here. Her face is much larger, so I would stick to at least 3 there. Once my skin was done, I moved on to the hair. And I'm just using 3 colors here. There's a lot of lines within the image in her hair, so you don't have to do all that much shading. Even if you wanted to leave a large highlight, it's not going to be as noticeable just because of all the lines within the stamp, which is helpful because even if you don't get a perfect blend, it still looks really good with those lines within her hair. So I started off with my darkest color. And just using flicks, I start out with the part where her part is and flicking out from there, leaving a few highlights on either side of her hair. Then I will go in with my mid-tone color and then just very lightly with my light color. Next, for her little raincoat, I decided to color this a darker orange color. So again, I'm starting out with my lightest color, which will not end up being my lightest color in the end, but I started with my Y35, mapping out my darkest areas, and then going in with my darkest color, which is actually an E marker. It's an E09. The four colors that I use, one is an E marker, two are a YR marker, and one is a Y marker. A lot of times these will work well together, so you just have to kind of experiment with different color blends. Once my darkest color is down, I will move on to my two midtones, which are YR markers, and just start flicking that color out a little bit. In this particular image, the highlight area is much larger than the other two panels. So instead of using the Y35, I did use the Y35, but I ended up adding a fifth color for this one. I used the Y38 just because I wasn't getting a good enough blend from the YR16 to the Y35, so I did add that additional mid-tone color in. Plus the area was just too large to have that just a solid color. You could skip out on that fifth color or even a fourth or third color for her little shoes, kind of like her arms and legs. Those are really, really tiny areas, so you don't need to do as much shading as I did. Once her little jacket was colored on all three panels, I moved on to her little scarf, and I wanted it to match somewhat, so I'm doing these in yellow. Now her scarf on the first panel is actually different from the other two panels. It has like dots on it, but that's okay. I don't think anybody's going to notice that it's different, but I colored it basically the same way. My darkest areas will be on either side. Because this is wrapped around her neck, it's kind of like a rounder object. So you want your highlight to be in the center. Use the lines that are drawn within the image to help you with your shading. Those little lines that extend, that is where your shading should be. So use those. Those are there to help you. So with the exception of the scarf on the little girl with the little dots on it, I colored this one the same exact way as I colored the first. Once my scarves were done, I moved on to the little animals. On the first panel, I believe it's a cat. On the second panel, it's a little dog, but I did use the same colors. I'm using my E50 markers to color both of them. I put a little bit more shading on the dog just because I wanted the cat to be a little bit lighter. Even though I'm using the same three markers, you can control how dark the image will be. I was going to use different colors, but when I had splattered that water after I removed my masks, some of the ink bled onto this little cat, so I needed to make it dark enough where it would cover up those areas. But I'm basically doing the same thing, starting with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, going in with my dark color, then my mid-tone, and then my lightest color. Some of the areas must seeped out on the dog as well. His little ears especially, the mask wasn't sticking when I was doing my ink blending, so I wanted to keep them a little bit darker than what I had initially intended to cover that up as well. Once my little animals were colored, I moved on to the leaves and the umbrellas. I decided to keep these the same color just to kind of have some consistency throughout the entire card. So obviously the leaves will be green. So I am using my YG90 markers. And I'm just using three colors here, especially for the little tiny leaves. They are very tiny, so you don't need to do much shading on those. And I'm just concentrating on the darkest areas being in the center. So again, starting with my lightest, flicking out where my darkest areas will be. And I'm not really worried about having, you know, those lines and the veins, I guess they call them, within the leaf. I'm just adding a little shading to these. They're not the focal image. They're just kind of a background. I'll add in my darkest color, then my mid-tone, and then my lightest again. Now for the little umbrellas, the little dog has an umbrella and the girl has an umbrella. Hers has a little bit more detail on it, and typically with an umbrella like that, I would color it at least 2 different colors, with each little section being different. But I couldn't decide what other color I wanted to bring into the card, so I decided to just color it all the same. My initial plan was to go in with a gel pen later on and add detail to every other section, like polka dots or stripes or something like that. But I ended up not liking that. I added a few reflections and then realized that the white gel pen wasn't mixing well with this particular background, so I did skip that part. So again, this is a rounder object, so I'm concentrating on my darkest areas, in this case being the top and the bottom, so that where the umbrella is rounded, that is where your highlight will be. Now for the little flowers that the little girl is holding in the third panel, I wanted to somewhat match the background. So I ended up using my V markers. Here I'm just taking just one single green and coloring in the stem, and then just adding a little bit of shading to that one leaf that's just a little bit lighter, or larger rather. So for the flowers, I just started off with my darkest color here. Because it's such a tiny area, this is when I usually start off with my darkest color, because if you blend too much or add too much saturation to the paper, it will bleed. And it being such a tiny area, you would notice it more if it bled. So I start off with my darkest, then go to my mid-tone, and then my lightest. And for the little centers, I just used one single color. I brought in an RV marker. Once the flowers were done, I realized I missed the little cat's nose, so I just brought in my R20 marker just to color in his little nose. Then I took my white gel pen and added those reflections to the umbrella, and I still was contemplating on whether or not to add any kind of detail other than the reflections, but I just decided to keep it as is. So for my sentiments, my first and my third panel will have different sentiments on it. Like I said, I wanted this to be an encouragement card to just basically show that it'll get better. So for my first sentiment, I am stacking my single words here to create one large sentiment. And once I put that onto my acrylic block, I'll just take whatever ink I have lying around and stamp that out on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure it is lined up correctly before stamping it on my card panel. For my card panel, I'll be stamping this with VersaFine ink. It seems to be the boldest black ink that I've found. It does take a minute or two to dry because it is a pigment ink, so make sure that you don't touch it immediately like you would a dye ink. You will smear it. For the third and final panel, I'll go ahead and basically do the same thing, just lining up my sentiment, stamping it out on a scrap piece of paper, and then finally stamping it on my card panel. Now for the card base, when you fold this over because you have 3 sides that are identical in size. You will have to trim whatever one you're going to fold in the center. There's 2 different ways you can fold it, so whatever you decide, you'll have to trim just a slight amount off the edge of that, just so that it folds up better. I'll go ahead and add my panels on with my Tombow Mono multi glue. And then there were a few areas that the mask wasn't completely cut correctly, or ones that I maybe altered. I just went in with a Copic marker that was as close to the color of the distress ink that I could find and just fixed up those areas. But that's it for today. Thanks so much and have a great day.